This video is going to be the first of 4 videos where we create a full stack mean application. So mean stands for MongoDB, Express.js, Angular framework, and then Node.js. So in this first video, we're going to build a single page application using Angular. And our application is going to serve as a diary where we can add, edit, and delete entries. So it's going to be a fairly simple application, but we're going to be covering many different Angular features, such as routing, creating components, using directives, and many, many more. And then in future videos, we're going to begin using Express and Node.js. And then lastly, we're going to be using MongoDB for persisting. So we're going to begin by creating our Angular app from the terminal with ng new my-diary. I will add Angular routing and CSS. And after this finishes installing, I will open the newly generated folder in VS Code. If we expand the source folder, we will see the index.html file, which loads the app-route, and the app folder, which also contains the main component with the landing page. I'm going to begin by clearing the app component HTML file so we can start our project from scratch. And looking at our design, we will have 2 main components to start. So we're going to have a header which contains the navigation and a diary component that contains the entries. I'm going to run ng-gc header and ng-gc diary to create both of these components. In the app component, I will add 2 tags to show the header component on top of the diary component. And if I run the application with ng-serve in the terminal, we can see it open on localhost 4200. I'm going to improve our styling on the project by using the Bootstrap framework. We will install this by stopping our application with Ctrl+C and by running npm install -- save bootstrap at 3. We can now see Bootstrap has been added into our Node modules folder, and we can add this into our project in the Angular JSON file on line 30 within the styles array by pointing to the Node modules, Bootstrap, dist, CSS, and then the Bootstrap min CSS file. Now back in the app component HTML file, I will add a div with the class container around our app to add the default margins and responsive behavior to our web page out of the box with Bootstrap. If I relaunch the app, we can see our components have slightly been centered. And next, what we're going to do is configure the routing behavior so we can access other components when we later create them. I will remove the app diary tag and add the router outlet. And the router outlet will display the components we desire as per the route we navigate to. Then in the app routing module, I will instruct the empty path to show the diary component. If we restart the app, we can see the diary component has been shown. Now we're going to improve our header component by using Bootstrap to show a nice title link to the home page and also some navigation links to the home and also the data entry. You can visit getbootstrap.com for the nav documentation to understand how you can customize the web page to have it exactly the way that you want it. But if I head into the header component HTML file, I will add a nav with class navbar default. And within there, I will add some branding with a div of navbar header and an anchor tag of class navbar brand. And I'm just going to add some text to that anchor tag of my diary. And lastly, outside the navbar header, I will create an unordered list of class navbar-nav with 2 list items within an anchor tag of home and also diary entry. If we head back to our app, we can already see it looking a bit better. Okay, let's modify the diary component to show a table of entries. So first I will add a header of h2 tag with welcome to the diary. And below that I'm going to create a table with the table tag, and I will use the Bootstrap CSS of table-bordered to add spacing and bordering to our table. I will use the thead tag to capture the headings of the table, and I will add a row with tr followed by the headings of date, entry and actioned with the th tags. So th will stand for table heading. And below I will add tbody for the table body, followed by 2 rows with the table data. So I'm going to have tr for table row, and then within those table rows I'm going to add td for table data, and I'm going to populate that with some demo data. At the end I'm just going to put no action under the action column, which we will later populate when we want to edit or delete our entries. Now if we open our app, we can see how we would expect the app to appear, with the header across the top and a table just down below. The next step will be to define some data to auto-populate our table rather than manually entering it here like so. We're going to store our data for the table in a shared service, as we will later require other components of our application to also access the diary entries that we have stored on the app. For example, if we would like to edit an entry, we would need to pull in that data into a new component. Let's say that's called the edit component. So the data is required in more than one place within our application. So to begin, I will create a folder called shared within the app folder and define a model class that will store our diary entries. I'll create a file called diary-entry.model.ts and export a class called diary entry, and I will use the constructor parameters to define a public date and entry property, both of type string. I will also create a service in a new file called diary-data.component.ts with the name diary data service. I will annotate the class with @injectable, and then that will be provided in the root. So all components of our application now have access to this service. And I will define a new array called diary entries of type diary entry and initialize it with 2 entries. Back in the diary component, we will define an array of diary entry as an empty array and initialize it in the ng-on-init function. Just a small note, ensure you have strict property initialization set to false in the tsconfig file to ensure that this style of initialization compiles. I will inject the diary data service into the diary component constructor and assign diary entries as equal to the diary entries of the diary data service. Now within the diary HTML, I can now use the ng-for structural directive to loop over the diary entries that we have in the TypeScript file. In the first table row tag, I will use an asterisk followed by ng-for equals to let diary entry of diary entries, and this will allow us to loop over our array of diary entries. Our HTML table rows will now be repeated for every entry that we have in our array. I will use string interpolation to populate the first table data with diary.date and the second with diary.entry. I can remove the second table row and leave the action as no action for now. And now we can see this working as expected within our application. I can now test this, so if I head back into the diary data component, I can add a new entry and see it automatically reflected in our table back in our application, all thanks to this ng-for loop. In this next section, we're now going to update our action column in our table. So under the action column, I would like an option to either edit or delete an entry. So in the diary component HTML file, I will replace no action with 2 buttons, and I will use the class styling from Bootstrap to style the buttons. I will use button-light for the edit button and button-danger for the delete button. And also in the CSS file, I will style the buttons apart from each other with button, open curly brace, and then margin-left as 10 pixels. So this will make sure that the buttons are not sitting over each other when they're in the table. Now to begin deleting entries, I will add a click listener into the delete button. I will want to tell the component which array item that we want to delete. To extract the index of the array item, we can use let I equals index in the ng for loop and pass in I to the onDelete method. If I implement the method in the component and print the index value, we can now see 0, 1, and 2 being printed into the browser console. To actually delete the entry, we will create an onDelete method in the diary data service, passing in the index number. And within that function, we very simply perform a splice on the data entries array to remove the index of that item. So that involves doing this.diaryEntries.splice index and then number 1. And back in the diary component, we will reassign the diary entries array with this.diaryEntries equals this.diarydataservice.diaryEntries. Now the method of deleting the diary entries, however, is not as effective as it could be. All components within the application will need to keep calling get on the diary entries from our diary data service every time that they're updated. We can instead use a subject, which is a specific type of observable that allows values to be casted out to multiple observers at the same time. So if the diary entries are used by other components, they can all receive the updated entries together without having to always reassign the values manually. So first I will define a new subject in the diary data service, and I will import the subject from the Reactive.js package. Back in the diary component, I will create a new subscription to that subject, which is also from the Reactive.js package. And then within the ng-on-init function, we will now subscribe to the diary data service subject with this.diaryEntries_sub equals this.diarydataservice diary subject.subscribe. Now within this subscription, we will receive the entries as an array from the subscription, and we will assign this.diaryEntries as those entries. So whenever the diary data service subject emits a new array for the diary entries, the diary component will receive that array and it will automatically update its array. I will implement the onDestroy lifestyle hook as well, so that we can unsubscribe from this subscription each time that the component is destroyed. So how do we actually emit an updated piece of data? So we do this by using the next keyword. In the diary data service, we can use this.diarysubject.next, open bracket, and then this.diaryEntries. And this will emit the updated array once the diary entry has been deleted. Now all subscribers to the subject will receive the updated array in our application. Back in the diary component, we no longer need to reassign the diary entries after the delete, as the subscription we have within the ng-on-init function will automatically reassign the array every time that the next method has been called from the diary data service. If we head back into the app, we can now see the delete button working. Before we learn how to edit an entry, let's take a look at how we can add an entry, and for this we're going to be using the Reactive Forms approach from Angular. To begin creating our form to add new entries, I will create a new component with ng-gc diary form. To display this form, I will register the component in the router module with the entry of data-entry, and I will allow us to navigate to this page from the header by adding a router link directive to the data entry button. I will also add a router link for the home button and the branding, so we can click our way back into the home page. If I restart the application, we can now see the router links working. Within the diary entry HTML file, I will add a row and a cold div to make it easier for us to modify this page in the future. And I will add a form tag within this. I'll be using the reactive form approach, where we will be synchronizing the input elements of our form with a form group object and extracting the values from that object when the form has been submitted. And we're going to see how this works very soon. To enable the Reactive Form directives, we will have to import the Reactive Forms module in the app module file. The Reactive Forms module is imported from the Angular Forms package. In the diary form ts file, I will create my form object called diary form as type form group. I will initialize this with an ng on init. Form group will represent our form, which will contain several inputs, represented by form controls. Within the form group constructor, I will use a curly brace to define our form controls. So each control has a key, and I will use date and a colon, followed by a form control that defines the default value of this field, and also any validators that we might have. There are many other ways that we can enhance our form controls, but just for now we're going to specify what the default value is and if we have any validators, and we're going to see the value this brings to our form in a moment. So we will just say that the validators is that this field has to be required for our form to be submitted, and I will do the same for the entry field of our form. We will come back to the default value. Back in the HTML file, I will annotate the form tag with form group directive as equal to the name of our form group in the component. So we're going to call this diary form. I will now create the form within a div with the form-group class for styling, and I will add two labels for the date and also for the entry, and two text inputs for these. I will use the form control class on both the entries for styling, and I will synchronize them back into the form group object with the form control name property. So this is going to link back into our keys that we have in our form group object. Outside the div, I will add a submit button with the button success class to make it green. And in the form tag, I will register the submission with the ng submit event emitter to the onSubmit method. Now when we submit the form, we will want to update the diary entries in the diary data service, and then we will want to navigate back to the home page to show these new entries. For both of these steps, I will inject the diary data service and the router from the Angular router package into the diary form component through the constructor. I will create the onSubmit function and first console log our diary form, just so that we can see the object that we create when we submit our diary form. Now in the browser we can submit an entry with the date of 10th of June, and we're just going to put entry 4 as the entry, and we can hit submit. And then in the console we can see our submitted form. If we expand the value, we can now see the form date and entry. So we're going to now use these values within our component. So back in the component, I will create a new diary entry using the form by extracting the form.value.date and also the form.value.entry. I will pass this diary entry to the diary data service into a function called onAddDiaryEntry, and within that method we will simply push the new entry into the diary entries, and then we will broadcast our new diary entries array with the diary subject.next method. Now our home component will receive the updated entries with the new diary entry, and as it receives the new array of entries, it will populate the table automatically. Back in the diary form component, I will use this.router.navigate by URL, passing in an empty string to navigate back to the home page. We can now test this out by making an entry and hitting submit. We can now see the entry being added and us being taken back to the home page. One last change I'm going to make to the form is to disable the submit button if the form is invalid. The form is invalid if either field is empty, specified in our form control with these validators. We can do this by accessing the disabled directive and making it equal to the inverse of diary form.valid. This boolean is evaluated every time that we update our form to ensure all validation is passing. Now when either field is empty, the submit button will be disabled. To begin creating an edit option, I will add a click listener to the edit button. Our design for edit will involve first navigating to a new route called /edit, and then / the index number of our entry from our array. In the onEdit function, I will pass in the index number, and then in the diary component, we will inject the router and use it to navigate to this new route, constructed within an array. The first item will be the word edit, and the second will be the index ID. Now back in the router module, I will register the new pattern for /edit /:ID. The colon tells Angular that the ID is a parameter, and for this route we will load the diary form component. Now if we head back into our app and select edit, we will see the route as edit /0, and the form component is loaded. Now back in our diary form, it gets a little bit complicated because we're going to have two different behaviors. One will be for a new entry, where the form is going to be empty, and when we submit the form, we're just going to be adding into our diary entries. And the second where it is in edit mode, where the form is pre-populated, and when we submit the form, we're updating an existing entry. In the diary form, I will create a boolean called edit mode as false. But how do we know if we should be in edit mode? And we do this by accessing the route. We can access the current route by first injecting the activated route into the constructor, and then within the ng-on-init function, we will obtain the param map of the route and subscribe to it. The subscription will pass in the parameters that we have in our current route, where we can check if the map has the ID. The ID is the same name that we provide in the Angular router. And as we know, if the ID parameter is present, then we will be in edit mode. So we will set edit mode to true, otherwise we can set it as false. We're going to pre-populate the form by applying the date and content value of our diary entry property into the form. If the diary entry is undefined, we will leave the boxes as empty as we would otherwise see when we're adding a new entry. We will first populate the diary entry property with the diary data service. So I'm going to create a new method called getDiaryEntry that takes an index number and returns an entry. The method will very simply use return followed by the extract operator to extract all the values from an object so that we don't modify the original entry. And we will request this.diaryEntries and use the index number in squared brackets to return just that single entry. The diary entry instance will be used to populate the form when we're in edit mode. Just below this, I'm going to define a new string as param_id to show the ID of the entity, and I will assign it to the param map subscription, and I'm going to add a plus sign to the start to signal that it's a numerical value, and I'm going to add a bang operator at the end to remove the null check on this item. We will assign the diary entry by calling getDiaryEntry method. Now that we have a diary entry populated, we can bind its values into the HTML by using the default value from our form control, and this is where we're revisiting that first argument within our form control. I will make the default value is equal to the diary entry.date if we're in edit mode. Otherwise, we're just going to leave this as empty. And I'll do the same for the entry. Just a small note that it is important we add this subscription first in the ng-on-init function to ensure the diary form is updated after we evaluate what the activated route is. If we head back into the app, we can now test this by selecting Edit and seeing our form populated along with the updated route. The final piece of the puzzle involves submitting the updated entry. If I go back to the onSubmit method, I will surround the onAddDiaryEntry method with an if statement to check if it is in edit mode. And if it is, then we will call a new method in the diary data service to update the entry. I will pass in the param ID, which will be the index to update and the entry. Then in the diary data service, I will access the diary entries followed by the index in squared brackets as the entry, and broadcast the change to the diary entry subject. If we test this out, we can see our form is now updating. Now let's take a look at our working application. I can add new entries and I am taken back to the home page after they have been submitted. I'm able to delete entries and I can also update existing ones. It's a pretty simple app so far, but we've covered many different Angular fundamentals with multiple components. We've used routing, centralized services, subscriptions, subjects, and also data binding to create and dynamically populate our components. This is really great work. Thank you so much for watching this video. Join me in the next video where we will begin to look at Node.js and Express.js for persisting our data in a backend as opposed to having it all presented in Angular.